It's time for another RotoViz Overtime Dynasty Reanimators episode. Looking forward to this one, Shawn. We have lots of different things to discuss. We're going to discuss a trade offer that has come in for our team that we're going to dive into. We had a couple of back and forths, and we have one standing order available at the moment that we're going to talk through today to see if we go with it, if we counter, or if we accept it, Shawn. So looking forward to doing that. We're also going to talk through something that I think is very interesting, is the dynasty value of players versus what is available now in, let's say, Best Ball Mania underdog ADP or Best Ball ADP in general, or what we're looking at for redraft ADP moving forward. So the difference in trying to acquire some of those guys versus their value in either dynasty or redraft and how to play that out. So I'm really looking forward to this one, Shawn. Third show of the week. We had two awesome shows earlier this week. King Cap on both of those. We did a 0RB Best Ball Mania 4 draft, and then we also talked to him about his experiences last year, winning the regular season with a 0RB roster, and then also what he thinks can be learned from 2022 to implement into 2023 if you're trying to win some huge prizes. So, Shawn, fun week all in. How are you doing as we get ready to kick this off? I know it's been a busy week for you. You've done a lot of podcasts this week, Pros versus Joes, along with Ben Gretsch. You also have done the Best Ball Banana Stand with Pete Overzet. So you have been spending a lot of your life in these StreamYard conversations over the last few days.
And I love it. It's been so much fun chatting with all of you guys and, bantering, learning from the best minds in fantasy football. And just, again, one of the things that Cap said that was just so cool is, sort of the great fortune that we have to be living in 2023 and playing fantasy football. So much gratitude for that. Colm, today we're going to look at Dynasty. We're going to be back into our Dynasty Reanimators hats, and we're going to try and reanimate our team. We're going to try and reanimate a few of these listener teams. The process is just so much fun. And we're moving into training camp, which means we're going to have a lot more volume of trade offers. We're going to have more player movement. You're going to have guys who are rising, guys who are falling, dynasty managers who are trying to sort of restructure their portfolios to make sure they're set and ready to go for the season. One of the best times of the year. This is the best time of the year for Dynasty, I think, outside of that week right around the NFL draft. We received an offer of a first-round pick. And in RV Triflex leagues, these first-round picks are so valuable for all of the obvious reasons, and then for the additional reason that it helps you move some of your team's value into a category that isn't impacted by the various cut downs. So we're going to try and get down to 20 players. One of the ways that you can do that, obviously, is offload players for picks, and those picks will stay with you going forward. So when you get an offer that includes a first-round pick, you always have to be very serious about that, even if the offer seems pretty aggressive. Now, this was an offer that wanted a lot back. It was asking for both Jerry Jeudy and DeAndre Hopkins. That turned out to be a little bit above kind of where our taste was on these guys. I have Jerry Jeudy ranked as the wide receiver 14 at the 310 in terms of Superflex Dynasty startup value. I'll probably move that down slightly because it does look like he could get squeezed in this 2023 Denver Broncos offense. And yet, Jeudy is one of these guys where you can pick him up now. Maybe you can pick him up at a little bit of a discount. And I mean, he's got a long run yet before he's going to be at that point where you need to move him because the trade value is going to start to fall off.
He just turned 24.
So you think about next year, if the situation is dramatically improved, which I think almost regardless of the way this year goes, his situation will be improved next year. Now, if he has a bad year, he's going to drop in price. And so it's not to say that even if he has a bad year, he's going to retain all of his value. We want to make sure that we know what the difference is there. But Jeudy, an interesting guy. DeAndre Hopkins is interesting. I have him at wide receiver 34 in round 7. And kind of sandwiched between Michael Pittman and Rashad Bateman, both of whom, have some pretty serious red flags for the season. Hopkins is one of these guys where when you're looking at him in a startup, there's a pretty severe trade-off to where, he could be one of the guys. You think about what happened in 2022, and a lot of these veteran receivers paid off handsomely, and they won leagues. And you look at the teams that won last season in Dynasty, and a lot of them don't really look like elite Dynasty rosters, and that can create some frustration for participants who maybe had younger teams. You start to rethink what you're doing. We want to encourage people not to do that. You want to build these really deep, strong teams. Probably Hopkins doesn't exactly fit that if you can move him. But if Jeudy was well above the level we would pay for a first-round pick, obviously throwing in Hopkins as well wouldn't work. We countered with Hopkins for that round one, kind of explaining where our value was on it and where we also place a random first-round pick into a startup draft. So, Colm, we sent that offer, and we got an interesting response, and one that gives us a lot to think about as we try and work through this trade.
Yeah, so I think obviously you mentioned the term so far. We started off with something, and I think, Shawn, league to league, I think we're higher on Jeudy than a lot of people, and I think people may be a little bit down on Hopkins landing in Tennessee, depending on who that manager is. So I can see that first offer making sense before it is sent. I didn't think it was egregious, but in terms of what we're valuing those players at, it was a long way off. So we go back with the Hopkins offer for the first rounder, and that's something that, again, depending on how they're trying to structure that deal, it might seem like we're going in low there, but I think that's pretty fair from a counterpoint. We get an offer back, Shawn, which flips it around. I sent to you, this is a little bit interesting. They've come in offering the first round pick to us for the player, but their counter offer back to us then is for us to move our 2024 first to pick up Deebo Samuel. So I think that how that would fit and align with our roster, for example, how things would pair from even the future picks, how we would cut down players potentially moving forward. Deebo Samuel for a first, Shawn, I find very, very interesting, and I think it's something that with that offer, we have to seriously consider it. It comes into then, the conversations we have about, trying to gather those picks, trying to have the extra picks on the roster, but there are certain players then that are worth putting those picks up for. So we would still be finding ourselves in a situation where we're going to have to cut down, and we're also going to be adding an additional name obviously onto that roster while losing that pick. So all that going into consideration. We currently have 25 players. We talked about this on last week's show about the players that we might have to potentially cut when it comes to that pre-week one cut down to 20 players. This will be adding another name to that list. We currently don't have a 2024 second round pick, so that would leave us, if we trade this first round pick, with a third, 3/4, a fifth, and a seventh. So we have no sixth round pick either. Currently, though, Shawn, on our roster, if we look just at the wide receiver position, it's DeAndre Hopkins, Jerry Jeudy, Justin Jefferson, George Pickens, Jameson Williams, Justin Ross, Quentin Johnson, Rondell Moore there as well. So a really strong core. The decision then is adding Deebo Samuel to that core, the right decision. We also have options to potentially move Hopkins, Jeudy, Pickens moving forward as well. So it really has a lot of different elements to play. And what would be the first element that you're looking at here on the decision? Is it straight up, is this a good value for the player? Is it what we would give up? Or is it, how does this fit into the roster for this season and beyond?
That's a really good way to frame it. So we're thinking about, first of all, the value in a vacuum. Secondly, how it fits our particular roster from a win now perspective. Third, we're thinking about it from the perpetual reloading type of perspective and where we would be with those future picks. And we're looking at the possibility of, if the value is significant enough, do we make that move and then try and get the pick value back in other ways? Now, it's always a little bit risky to think about from that perspective, because you can never guarantee that those future trades will materialize, even if you make really strong offers. Now, a lot of people will think about this from the perspective of, I'll make a move and I'll make subsequent moves, but their subsequent offers are all bad, and then they're frustrated that they can't get any player movement. You're going to have to make realistic offers, but even in that case, you don't always have trades come to fruition. So you want to keep the risk in the back of your mind that you'll be stuck with this roster. But because we have such a well-rounded roster, we have 3 elite or potentially elite tight ends. That's extremely important in the tight end premium version. We have 2 veteran QBs who should be good for a while, and then the huge wild card QB in Sam Howell. If your roster is already broken and you have a position that's going to be very difficult to fill, it doesn't mean you're going to tank the season, but you want to be very, very careful about how you give up those future picks, because you could be forced into future trades where the value is very much not in your favor as you try and fill your roster up. You don't ever want to get into that position. The trick can be that sometimes you tell yourself, well, I don't have that as an issue, so I can go ahead and make this trade, but then it limits your options because you don't have those picks. But we kind of go back and we look at it in a vacuum, and I have Deebo Samuel ranked as the wide receiver 21 as the 412. That contrasts with his Dynasty ADP in the Triflex format, where he is going as the wide receiver 25 at the 605. So if you have sort of a round and a half difference there in how you're valuing the player, that can be a big deal when you're looking at making that move. You're getting some excess value back in relation to what a trade calculator is going to tell you is the true value on the players there. The other question that you're wanting to ask yourself is, where would you put a random first round pick within the context of this year's startup? Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that depending on how trendy the next year's rookie draft is, you can get those future firsts valued anywhere from the 4-5 turn to, somewhere in the 8th round. And I always find myself conflicted on this, in that it's extremely important to get those rookie picks. The upside when they hit is absolutely massive. You can tell yourself a story that, okay, I'm trading for actually the 110 or 111, and that makes it less valuable, except we know that the future is going to have a lot of chaos, and these teams can have a couple of their guys hit, and suddenly they're in the backdraw, right? So you want to understand just how much randomness can come into play when you're trading for one of the future picks, especially in a format where you have 20 guys instead of 30. If you got those extra 10, very deep, strong players, a person's roster can't fall apart in quite the same way. So we have all those calculations going on in the back of our heads. But Colm, when I'm thinking about where these picks slot in, the true value is going to usually be more in that 8th or 9th round range if you're approaching it from the right perspective. Because even as dynasty drafters get a lot savvier, ADP is still broken in where wide receivers are going to go. So your 8th round pick is going to be a lot more valuable than the random 8th round pick. You want to keep that in mind as you're pursuing it. So we have that as the framework. We have that as the context. How are you looking at Samuel when you have a 27-year-old? We talk about you need to be able to play a player for 2 years and then trade them at their peak. You can't really do that for Samuel. And so my ranking on him is pretty aggressive. But when you look at the rankings there, I have him ranked 1 spot ahead of Stephon Diggs, who, in terms of ADP, is going as the wide receiver 15 at the 403. So it's kind of the inverse there. And Diggs is somebody you definitely are not going to be able to play for 2 years and then move. But Samuel could do the flip of that, where he could be a top 5 wide receiver for 2 years and then be in the general age range that Diggs is now. And we see that the general age range that Diggs is in right now is moving him to wide receiver 15. So those are our considerations. What are your thoughts in terms of accepting, in terms of countering? Where are we here?
So you mentioned Deebo, 27 years old. I was actually, looking at your rankings, I wasn't expecting him to probably be as high as he was. But then when you go through the rest of the list of the players that go beyond wide receiver 21, you start to get into a lot more question marks around players. In terms, though, Shawn, of veteran wide receivers, outside of Cooper Kupp, who's wide receiver 13, Tyreek Hill, who's wide receiver 12, then you have Chris Godwin, wide receiver 20. Deebo is the highest of that veteran tier. And I think he's in that zone where there's a very, very limited window where you could do what you just said, have him for 2 years and still move him. But you are kind of playing with fire when it gets to that point. Deebo almost feels like a player that you want on the roster if you're really going for it this season. And then basically what you're trying to do at that point is get him for this season rather than having to wait for next year's pick, hoping he has the season that you want him to have to help you win a championship and then be able to move him next year. So it might, it's even a shorter window, I think, that you would have with him. He will, his birthday January 15th, so it will be 28 early next year, pre-Super Bowl. And I think obviously his value is going to deteriorate. Even if he has a good season, I still think he's going to continue to move down the draft board here. So it's kind of like you're trying to turn that pick into a player for a 1 year rental and then try and cash back out. And really what you would need to do in your scenario is that you're cashing back out for a late first, early second round pick, which is going to put him into an 8th or 9th round value. So the move in is a good value at this current moment in time. The move out is, I think, going to be where we lose out if we were to acquire him. So I think based on the roster we have, I would be kind of thinking with that first round pick, if we were planning to give it up, looking at some of the potential options going in that range. But then when you look at the options that are going in that range, we have George Pickens on the roster, but you're in the Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, Diggs, then you're getting into Dotson, Ayuk, Addison. I would much rather have Samuel than Ayuk, who is going, as one of the next options there. And as much as I like Dotson, he's somebody who is probably a second round with something thrown in rather than a first round pick. So I think this is one that is really on the edge. And I think this is one that, Shawn, you could nearly push me one direction and another whether we accept it. At the moment, I'd be on the decline side of things. The other element is, I don't really see that if we acquire him now that we move him before the NFL season. I think it's somebody who, if you're giving up that first round pick for, you're probably not going to get more than a first back. So I think that you're holding him at least through this season.
The last point is a good one, where if you make a move for a player, it's hard to flip him immediately for more value because nobody wants to be the guy who didn't get enough. And so you kind of anchor the price, at least in your own league, and at least in terms of what you can get. Maybe,
or you could get a player who's in their going into second year or third year, and the buzz comes with it that hypes it up, that he increases in value a certain amount, and you take that small win before the season. But with Samuel, Kyle Shanahan's talking about how many pictures he's been getting sent by Deebo and how good a shape he's in, but I don't see Samuel's value increasing that much between now and the start of the season, even with positive reports.
Right. I don't think that part of it will move the needle too much. I do think that there's a possibility that what we've seen with the wide receiver avalanche will continue to leak into everything, which you could argue that it should.
People won't want to miss out, is what you're saying, and they're going to pay those increased prices. I guess this fits in a bit to the question with a listener submitted question that came in, Shawn. I'll pitch the question now because it might fit from this perspective, but it's about dynasty value versus redraft or best ball if you're trying to perpetually reload your roster. The question revolves around somebody like an AJ Brown who's going before somebody like Garrett Wilson at the moment based on ADP in underdog or in best ball. How much should you be adding to somebody like AJ Brown to try and get a Garrett Wilson in dynasty? He mentions that Shawn has him as the wide receiver 3, but is it worth giving up more assets to move from, say, the wide receiver 6 to the wide receiver 3? So again, we're talking here though about how other formats may impact dynasty and player values this season and beyond. So I think it's a good time to pair it in. You think that people wanting to get those avalanches the part that'll be interesting for me is, although best ball has exploded in popularity, it's still a small segment of people playing fantasy sports or fantasy football. So then when we look at another website or people playing dynasty, there is overlap, but the overlap isn't as much as we think. It's not like if you have a Venn diagram, you're looking at the two portions. I think it's a much smaller portion that are meeting in the middle than we would think.
Right, but I think that you do have a lot of contamination across formats with ADP and with how people think about players. And so if we get Deebo Samuel moving from the back end of the third round in best ball and maybe even the 3-4 turn in redraft, where at least to this point, and depending on what your scoring format is, what your starting lineup requirements are, all of those kinds of things, you might have him slide into the early fourth in a redraft. If the pressure to take receivers pulls him into the mid-third or to the beginning of the third, which it's hard for me to understand why he's valued where he is, because the talent level there, and again, we saw this just in such a clear and dynamic fashion in 2021. And you look at Samuel, it's not a flash in the pan kind of thing. When he's been healthy, even stretching back to his rookie season, I mean, he is this Christian McCaffrey-esque type of player. He is a plus route runner. When the ball is in his hands, he's unstoppable. You have the normal kind of volume plus efficiency season that you get from a star. And then on top of that, you have the potential for individual seasons where you get these long touchdown spikes. Now, you can argue that we already kind of got that in 2021. That's probably the one that you get in his career, but it speaks to the overall talent there. And once you're now in an offense that doesn't have this looming threat of the mobile quarterback to just siphon so many total plays away, I mean, the price on Deebo is a little bit strange. The biggest reason for that, I think, is just that you can play the 49ers through some mildly cheaper options that are also exciting. So a lot of people will just wait to do that. But if you get him pulled up in other formats, it is going to put pressure also on his dynasty overall value. So you could benefit from that. You mentioned that you can move him for a player instead of a pick. You can just get younger there. One of the things that I think is kind of a fun way to think about it, and definitely leans into the reanimator perspective, definitely leans into the perpetual reloading perspective, is that you can do something that is psychologically very difficult, which is that you can acquire him right now. You can have the best team in week 12, week 13, as you're heading toward that trade deadline. And Colm, if we added Deebo Samuel and we ended up not having the best team, if we have kind of normal injury luck, if we have bad injury luck, it's going to be very difficult. You just don't have the roster depth to manage that. I mean, if you have a short bench and a big starting lineup, which is awesome. I mean, it's awesome, right? It's a great format, but it does create an environment where if you have bad injury luck, it's going to be a problem. If you have normal injury luck, or certainly good injury luck, I mean, I think that we have the best team. Now, you're going to be biased in favor of your guys and the guys you put on the team. And so you're probably a little bit higher than is completely objectively the case. But if you have the best team and you're heading toward the trade deadline and there is another contender where if they were to take Samuel from you, it would suddenly flip. And instead of you having the best team, they have the best team. And they're willing to offer you a young player who is not quite hitting yet. And so you think about guys who would have fit that mold last year. I mean, Pickens was good, but was he demanding the type of volume that made him a clear-cut starter and impact player as you go into the fantasy playoffs? Not really. I mean, Jahan Dotson has scored all these touchdowns, but again, wasn't commanding the overall volume. He's got some injury concerns. I mean, is he going to be a guy that you want to start and play in the fantasy playoffs if you've got the best team? Probably not. If you are willing to pull the trigger for Deebo Samuel, one of those guys, and a future first. Now, part of the problem with the future first is that at that point, it is sort of locked into being one of the late in the first round picks, but it's also a reason why that manager is more likely to be willing to give it away, because they also are saying, I mean, this is almost like a second round pick. What's the big deal? If you have the guts to do that, and we talk all the time about how getting the bye, making it to the semis, and then letting the randomness kind of play out, you still obviously want to win. And there is going to be a little bit of a difference if your projected point total in the semis and the finals drops a tad bit because you've made this move. But that's a way that you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You get the player for most of the season. You put yourself into that good situation. You benefit from the rise in his price because he's had a good year, and then you move him to somebody who has a lot of incentive to overpay you. How often is that exact scenario going to play out? Maybe not a ton, but it's something to consider, right? If you have a good player, in this case, if you have a star, those are the types of things that you want to think about as possibilities down the line. So there are a lot of different things you can do if you have a Deebo Samuel, even if you have like a Stephon Diggs. Old guys, but guys who are that good that when you're going to the playoffs, when you're fighting for the title, people do want those guys.
Yeah, that's all very true. But we also have to think of it from the perspective of like, it doesn't work out that way, and he has a bad season, and his price starts to go down, and people say, "Oh, this guy's getting close to 30 years old now, and nobody wants him." I think we're more likely to find somewhere in the positive ground, maybe not to the 99th percentile, but somewhere around the 75% of outcomes. But Shawn, the big question then comes down to, we don't have to make this specific move to have our lineup impacted now in July, but he certainly is somebody who immediately would go into our lineup, even with the wide receivers that I mentioned. You're looking then into the Jerry Jeudy, Justin Jefferson. I think he really slots in at that point into the lineup at wide receiver, and probably then into DeAndre Hopkins. So is that going to factor into some of the decision making here? If you
said it perfectly, which I think you did.
I think I said it pretty good.
So,
yeah, so it is basically that it'll be Justin Jefferson, Jerry Jeudy, and then I said he would fit into our current starting lineup at that point as basically our wide receiver 3, and then probably DeAndre Hopkins after that. And would that factor into our decision making now that he would be an instant, like to a strong wide receiver room, he would be an instant starter on the roster?
It does. And as you mentioned there, if you have a Jefferson, if you have then a Hopkins and a Samuel around them, you've got that great foundation. You have Jerry Jeudy with a pretty wide range of outcomes, but again, you're looking at him as a borderline foundation player. And then suddenly that last spot can be filled by George Pickens, Quentin Johnston, or Jameson Williams, the best of the 3 players. Now, that's the best case scenario. That's if all of the guys stay healthy. But if one of them gets hurt, you're still looking at 2 options there. If we go with our current lineup, and you have an injury, then you're starting to get down to the point where you might have to play a guy who isn't performing that well yet. That's sort of the case with most teams, with most dynasty lineups. You're going to have to start some players from time to time that have some questions. But when we're talking about building a dynasty, trying to push it to the very top of the league, if you get that locked in, 5 wide receiver starting lineup with other additional flex options from your tight end position, then you could offset if our quarterbacks are a little bit disappointing. We hope that they're not, but there is some question with Tua's health, with Stafford's ceiling, with what Howell will do. You can maybe offset if you have some weeks where Kenneth Walker or DeAndre Swift don't play. So it just gives you so much firepower and so much optionality there in the starting lineup. Colm, we're going to discuss this A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson question. It's such a fascinating question. But the thing I wanted to suggest to you was that a possibility for a counter would be to, instead of giving up that first round pick, we could also look at moving Jameson Williams. Would our opposing manager be interested in that? Now, the tricky part is that I do still actually have Jameson Williams as being worth more than a first round pick as well. And so, purely when we look at value, maybe you just prefer to get rid of that first round pick. I have Williams in there at wide receiver 26. That's the 509. Again, we said, probably more the 8th round is where the true value would be. But we're going to have a little bit of a roster logjam. Williams is not going to play, and he's not going to be eligible for IR under the FFPC rules. So you just have a dead spot there for the 6 weeks. We also now have more injury notes about him. When I update the dynasty rankings in the next couple of days, I'll probably need to move him down at least slightly. The person we're working with is going to be aware of that information as well. So his value is going to be declining some. But when you look at startup value over the last 17 Triflex drafts, you have Williams coming in there at wide receiver 24 at the 602. Samuel, again, wide receiver 25 at the 605. So Williams has been going ahead of Samuel. Even if you move him down a little bit with this newest news, it's kind of a wash. What are your thoughts on making a move where, I mean, do we want to give up on him without ever seeing him play? Probably no, but in terms of managing the roster, maybe there are some benefits.
Yeah, that's going to make it a bit tricky. Obviously, we have to see what the opposing manager would want to do there, but you would also be you would keep your pick for next year, but you would gain a player basically for those opening 6 weeks and the rest of the season. So there is a lot of reasons why you might do that, but you're looking at a player who's entering a second season, having not played much in that opening year, but had some real flashes, and we know what he did in college. So coming off that injury, that's the reason obviously he missed most of last year, but he's going to miss a good chunk of this year due to the suspension as well. So that is very interesting, Shawn. But I think what we're going to have to do is, this is a to-be-continued trade discussion. I think that we'll have to be opened up on an episode next week, and we'll have to let the listeners know what we decided to do at the end, because there's more discussion to be had here, it feels like, rather than wrapping it up here and making a decision. So I'm looking forward to continuing that offline. We'll come back with an update on that. But Shawn, the question then to finish it off is around, AJ Brown, and the example is AJ Brown and Gareth Wilson. What are your thoughts though on really paying up? We've talked about this at quarterback. We get a lot of questions about moving from a quarterback in tier 2 up to tier 1 and how much you have to pay to do that. We haven't really talked about it a huge amount at the wide receiver position. Is that something that you're looking to do? For example, the roster we have has Justin Jefferson, but how much are people going to give up in that scenario, which is even more than you would have to give up to get a Gareth Wilson? What's your thoughts there?
So with Wilson versus AJ Brown, it's really interesting. I have Wilson as the overall wide receiver 3, just ahead of CeeDee Lamb. I have those guys in Superflex, where the vast majority of players ahead of them are the QBs. I have Wilson at the 112, Lamb at the 201, and then AJ Brown at the 206. So you're talking about the wide receiver 3 and the wide receiver 6, and it's a case where the wide receiver 6 is maybe the best player at that position in all of football. His efficiency is through the roof. The big score potential is elite. The touchdown upside is at the very top of the NFL. With Garrett Wilson, we had the opposite, where the efficiency on a per target basis was fairly poor, in part because the quarterback play was atrocious. So you're working through in your mind what those trade-offs are and how comfortable you are with Wilson. You even think about something like last year, for example, where the rate at which you get the next step for guys who were rookie stars is extremely high. When you compare individual breakout cohorts, the rookie breakout group is the best going forward. And that's intuitive, right? But you do want to keep in mind things like what happened last year with a Kyle Pitts, where the volume, the target volume and those types of things actually was exactly what the thesis was, but the play volume and how the offense worked not only neutralized it, but killed it, especially because Pitts himself was not efficient on top of that. You don't necessarily want to overpay, obviously, for the next Kyle Pitts. But again, that's a pretty unique scenario that is unlikely here. But you do want to factor it in. You don't want to get so locked into the idea that Garrett Wilson is going to be the next Jefferson and Chase that you're not thinking about the downside. But the main thing that you're trying to do is that even though AJ Brown is so good, you are buying 3 or 4 years there of peak play. And a lot of people are going to push back and say, you want AJ Brown at 26 years of age. The number of years that Brown can play at a really high level are easily enough to swamp other considerations. And I think that's true. And yet you think about Deebo Samuel, who is just a year older, and how we're already into this mindset of maybe Deebo's value plummets. So that would be the reason for my rankings. When we look at where they're actually valued in these startups, they're right next to each other, where Garrett Wilson's the wide receiver 4 at the 203, AJ Brown, the wide receiver 5 at the 204. When the values are that close, and when you have an asset like an AJ Brown, if you have one specific player that you feel like you have to get to, that you only have one manager in that league who has the guy. So you have to work with what they want to do. And yet I would be very leery about overpaying at any given moment when things can change a little bit. It might be a situation too where maybe there's a different league where you can make a move that would work. The other thing that you can do here that I really like is to structure the trade where there is a bench player on the opponent's team who you love, and you have him ranked way ahead of ADP, and you have a bench player on your own team where you're more or less at market. And if you make that kind of move where you're actually offering a little bit of surplus value, but in your own rankings, it works for you, you make that offer. I mean, those are the kinds of things that you can do to make your rankings work for you and to make these trades very possible, right? You have to do something to grease the wheels. You want that something to also be beneficial. I mean, there are even cases where I've argued that you can take two guys at the very top of drafts that you're sort of agnostic on. You have the same ranking, and you can make a trade that looks like a high profile trade, but it's really all about the guys on the bench. Maybe it's a 3 for 3 where you get two guys off the other person's bench where you love them. And so you want to make that move. Those are some things you can do to not lose out as you're trying to build the team in the image that you want, which is by your structural preferences and with your preferred player archetype. So that's the way that I would look at doing that if you're trying to get a Garrett Wilson onto your own roster.
Yeah, I think you made, it's not the same point, but you summarized all that perfectly. But I think rather than look to move from, wide receiver 6 to wide receiver 3, you touched on the value of some of those players that other people may be almost like ready to cast aside, not really want, maybe aren't as interested in. That question came in from JD. And for example, on JD's roster, some of the wide receivers he has, one of them is, for example, Elijah Moore, who Shawn has talked a lot about this year. But I think there's far more to be gained from the players who are at that lower value who can really skyrocket in value than the little, Shawn mentioned being agnostic, the gap not being that huge versus which one you have. And if you have multiple dynasty leagues, you're kind of trying to acquire them across those places. But I think trying to get those secondary options that Shawn mentioned, I think there's where there's a lot to be gained. And we talked through a little bit on the trade that we received firstly for Hopkins and Jeudy. There will be some people who value both of those combined at a first round pick, but that isn't us in this case. But there may be another league where somebody is out on a player like maybe Jerry Jeudy, maybe they're spooked that he will get squeezed out a little bit more than Shawn mentioned at the start of the show. Maybe they're willing to move him at a price that you think, based on your rankings, is very much beneficial to add in. So some things to consider, but a fun conversation, Shawn, as we went through there. We'll have to talk more about what we do with this Deebo Samuel trade ourselves, but thanks to JD for sending in that question. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up at rotoviz.com. If you want to sign up and get 10% off, you can use the code RVRadio2023 at checkout. Shawn mentioned previously that those prices are going to go up, Shawn. I believe, listening to yourself and Pete, they are going up in the very near future. Is that correct?